Support for IPR comes from Orchestra Iowa, featuring the full symphony performing back-to-back the music of Elton John and Billy Joel at 7:30 on Saturday, February 17th at the Paramount. Tickets at orchestraiowa.com.
It's Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. It is Black History Month, and today we're revisiting some important events in Iowa history. Later this hour, a conversation about Alexander Clark, a very influential Iowan who is best known for filing a lawsuit that resulted in the desegregation of Iowa schools in 1868. But first, at the turn of the 20th century, when the first generation of Black Americans to be born outside of slavery was coming of age, the town of Buxton, Iowa, became Iowa's first fully integrated town, and the community thrived. We are going to listen back to my 2017 conversation with Rochelle Chase about the unique history of Buxton. Rochelle has written 2 books about this remarkable community, Lost Buxton and Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa. Hello, Rochelle.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to start actually with a little bit of your history, because you've only been living in Iowa for a couple of years, and you're a writer, but you haven't written history before. You've written some romance and some other things. But what drew you to Buxton? How did you find out about this town?
Well, in 2008, my romance instructor, we became really good friends, writing instructor, that is, and she lived here in Iowa, and she says, I've got this town you've got to visit. And I thought, sure, I'm game. So when I came to visit her in 2008, she took me to the site, and I thought, wow, I can't believe in the middle of, Iowa farmland, this town exists. And so each time I would come back and visit her, I'd go to the State Historical Society and I would collect notes. I'd listen to the audio tapes of the interviews of the former residents. And I was just intrigued, and I had no idea what I was going to do with that. I was like, okay, I'm just collecting it. I don't have any idea. And then when I moved here a couple years ago, I said, I think I want to turn that into a book. And I did.
And when you say visiting Buxton, Iowa, Buxton was in Monroe County, which is in sort of the south central part of Iowa, but it's a ghost town now. So when you went to Buxton, what did you see?
I didn't see much of anything. I saw the stone warehouse, which was crumbling, just some walls and, the framework for the roof. At that time, I think most of it was overgrown. Today, the Monroe County Historical Society keeps the lawn manicured. But then I think there were a lot of corn stalks and weeds and such. And so I saw the stone warehouse, and then I saw the vault, the company vault, and that was pretty much it. So it was really imagining, like I said, that, wow, such a great town existed here. And for the time, I couldn't believe it.
Well, let's go back in time to 1900 when this town was founded. And it was a company town founded by Consolidation Coal Company. And it was a town obviously founded totally on the basis of there being coal to mine in the area. As the town got started, though, it started in kind of a unique way with the company recruiting people of all races to come and work. And that was really unusual for the time, wasn't it?
It was. Well, I should say it wasn't the first time. In about 1880, Albia Mine had recruited African Americans to break a strike, mainly from Missouri. They were getting African Americans. Whitebreast was another mining company that had also recruited African Americans. But what was interesting about Whitebreast, they had built separate housing for the African-American miners to live in. I think Buxton and Muchicanock before it, they were the first to really do it on a larger scale. And obviously with Buxton, they were the first to integrate it. To integrate everyone. And like you said, they did also recruit other, people from Sweden, Slovaks, et cetera, and they would reach out to them as well. So I think they were the ones that did it most successfully and did it on the largest scale.
And when they recruited African Americans to come and work in the mines, I can imagine that at that time, companies that recruited African Americans saw them as an inexpensive workforce, but Consolidation Coal Company recruited them kind of on an equal basis with other workers. They didn't say, hey, come work for us and we'll pay you half as much as we pay the white workers.
Exactly.
They recruited them and paid them the same.
Exactly. which is really surprising, too, because when Buxton was founded, they did continue that process, at least in the early years, of continuing to recruit. And at that time, Buxton was unionized. So the black workers were definitely getting the same salary. So there was no incentive, really, for them to go and continue recruiting. But yet and still, they did. And don't really know why. There's no real records from consolidation to show, why did they do this? Same thing with the Buxtons. Just don't know why.
Where were they recruiting workers from? Were their employees coming from down south or just a little bit south?
No, it was mainly south. Virginia was one of the major states that they were recruiting from. And then also people, once they got here, they would write, they would write to their family members and have them come up as well. So Virginia, Kentucky, just places like that, a little bit in Missouri.
So as the town grew, it was almost 50-50. African American and settlers of European descent. A number of different ethnicities were represented from different countries back in Europe that kind of created their own little enclaves. But it was up to actually 55% African American at one point. Now, you mentioned that some of these other companies had created separate barracks or things like that, creating a segregated community as they recruited new workers. Now, Buxton didn't do that. So as the town grew, what did it look like as far as racial integration?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, to your point, they didn't do that. And they awarded, like housing, for example, it was awarded on a first-come, first-served basis. As the people came, they were obviously paid, equal wages, but they also had the opportunity to start businesses. They didn't have to, purchase things at the company store. They could start their own businesses. So there were quite a few African-American-owned businesses there in the town as well. And that was also where the people settled, also in the various areas of town. There were some segregated areas like Swedetown, East and West Swedetown, but it seems like that was more from, probably the common language. Also that a lot of times the Swedes own their own property, so therefore that was another difference with Buxton is you did not have to live in company housing, so you could lease, land in the, areas surrounding the downtown area. And so you did have, like I said, a little bit of segregation there, but there were some African Americans in Swedetown as well. So the makeup was very diverse.
And of course, men working side by side in the mines is one thing, but then there were the women and the children living side by side in the community. And there were a number of schools in Buxton, but the schools were not segregated?
No, the schools were not segregated. There were 3 elementary schools, one in one of the Swede towns, and then there was the 1st Street School and the 13th Street School in the downtown Buxton proper area, and they were integrated. They had black and white teachers teaching black and white students. The ones in Swedetown weren't as integrated, but there were some, African-American students there. So they were. The company store as well had African-American clerks, men and women, working there. Had about 85 employees, and 18 of them were African-American. So again, you had this really integrated town. And I think what is so fascinating about it was just for the time, that you had this not only right in the middle of Iowa and farmland, but that you had it in the country given what was going on at that time.
Absolutely. And honestly, there are so many communities today that are more segregated than Buxton was at that time, 117 years ago.
Yeah.
What about the churches in the community? And Buxton, we need to put this in perspective. Buxton was never a large town. What about 7,000 people?
The population has been all over the map. I had been sticking to the 5,000 to 6,000 range because looking at, some of the census records, looking at the number of people that came over from Muchikinac, looking at the number, they think they built maybe about 1,000 houses in the town, and some of the other research that I had uncovered, it seemed like 5,000 to 6,000 was more of the range in later publications. But it was not really a really large town, and yet you had all these amenities and you had all of this going on.
Well, and I think your book consists mostly of photos, and we'll spend more time talking about these really remarkable photos that you were able to share in Lost Buxton in a moment. But I remember reading in one of the captions of the photos that there were 8 churches in town. A lot of churches.
Yeah, you did
considering
ask about churches.
the
Yes.
the small size of the community.
Yeah.
When it came to worship, was that also something that was integrated, or did people sort of retreat to their own enclaves?
No, churches were pretty much segregated. Most of the residents said that was the case. And one of them had a story to tell, the two churches. There was a black church and a white church next to each other, and they used to, sing the hymns back and forth. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what someone had said. So, but they were segregated. People said it was by choice. If you wanted to go, you were not prevented, but people said that was pretty much by choice. But yes, at one time there were 8 African-American churches. There was also a Slovak church and a Swede church as well.
Many churches for a small community.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the businesses that grew up in the town. There were also a number of organizations that were founded in the community. There was a YMCA, and in fact, there were 2 YMCAs in Buxton. And why were there 2?
Well, the YMCA was almost like the crowning jewel of Buxton. It was they spent a lot of money on that, and there was actually one that was for the men and one that was for the boys. So that's why there was 2, because boys couldn't go to the men's Y until they were 21. So, but the company had spent $20,000 in building this, which again it was like the largest industrial YMCA. And it had everything. On the first floor, you had pool, gymnasium, bathing rooms. They had parlors and a library and a reading room with leather chairs and a mahogany pianola. The second level had an auditorium where they could seat like 8 to 1,000 people, and they would have programs and people coming in from different places. The Catholic Church had services on the second floor. They had movies regularly there, and then they had lodge meetings up on the top. And then in the Boys' Y, and the 2 were connected by a covered walkway. But in the Boys' Y, they had swimming pool, which was heated, and then they had roller skating and dances up on the second floor.
Rochelle Chase is the author of 2 books about Buxton, Iowa, Lost Buxton and Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa. We're listening back to our 2017 conversation. Rochelle will also be an expert reader on the February edition of the Talk of Iowa Book Club. We'll be talking about The Color Purple by Alice Walker on Tuesday, February 20th, and we'll talk more about Buxton in a moment. This is Talk of Iowa from IPR News.
Support for IPR comes from Orchestra Iowa, featuring the full symphony performing back-to-back the music of Elton John and Billy Joel at 7:30 on Saturday, February 17th at the Paramount. Tickets at orchestraiowa.com.
Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
It's Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. It's Black History Month, and today we're listening back to some conversations about important events in Iowa history. Later this hour, we'll learn about Alexander Clark, a very influential Iowan who is best known for filing a lawsuit that resulted in the desegregation of Iowa schools in 1868. Right now, we're listening to a 2017 conversation with author Rochelle Chase. She's written 2 books about Buxton, Iowa, Lost Buxton and Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa. Right around the turn of the 20th century, when the first generation of Black Americans to be born outside of slavery was coming of age, this town of Buxton became Iowa's first fully integrated town, and it was a thriving community. And Rochelle, before the break, we were talking about the YMCA, and I want to talk more about the rich cultural community that developed in Buxton. There was a lot to do at the 2 different YMCAs and at the churches, of course, and then there were a couple of different thriving business districts as well. Tell me more.
The businesses, there were a lot of businesses were downtown. There were about 20 different independent businesses downtown. Anything from, there was a music store. There were several different grocery stores. There were, of course, as I mentioned before, there were bars and, I shouldn't say bars, more saloons and gambling establishments that were on the outskirts of Buxton. Buxton did not allow that in town. So it happened, on the fringes. There was also a bakery. There were 15 miners that had gotten together and formed this bakery and laundry business. There were restaurants. There were hotels. At least 2 African-American owned hotels there in Buxton, the bigger ones. There was just a lot also socially to do for men and women. There were lodges, the Masons, the Elks. There were literary organizations for women and men. The YMCA had a glee club. There were basketball, baseball. They had traveling, performances come. And there was just a lot going on, not only for us, a town that size, but also it would draw people from the surrounding communities into town. There was also a lot of commerce going on with people selling things. Not only, the people within Buxton, but farmers and such would come in from out on the outskirts of town and sell their goods. There just was a wealth of businesses in the area. And that was another thing that was a little bit unique in that most mining towns, they did not allow
They just
private
had the
businesses.
company store.
Exactly.
And that was it.
And you were required to buy from there. And that was another money-making source for the mining company.
Well, and Buxton did have a company store,
Yes.
and that company store seemed to have everything that anybody could possibly need with clothes and food and a bank and all of that. But they did allow these other businesses to grow up and clearly thrive in that community.
Exactly.
Outside of school, we have this wealth of archived oral histories that were collected in the 1980s by some wonderful Iowa historians. And they, have shared, and you share in your book, a number of quotes from those histories with people talking about what it was like to live in Buxton. So outside of school, did the children play with each other? Were there interracial friendships, or was this something that was limited to school?
The people interviewed were mixed on that. Some said no, outside of work and, social, like public things like games and performances and movies. They said, no, we really didn't socialize. But then a surprising number did. Men would say they would drink and gamble together. One woman had stated, I think it was Dorothy Collier, had said no, her mother had, white friends and they would come over and have quilting parties. It really just depended on the people that were interviewed. So they were mixed reviews on that.
And mining towns had a reputation for being kind of rough communities. Obviously, there would be a lot of men in one place, not necessarily a lot of families in some of these small communities. And Buxton had its share of trouble. Was there a major crime element?
Well, it depends on who you ask, meaning a lot of the people in Buxton felt like that reputation wasn't deserved. They felt like, it's like any other town. There are parts, that you don't go into at night, like Coopertown, Sharp Inn, the places that had the gambling. You didn't go there at nighttime. But by the same token, they felt comfortably safe. Many people said they left their doors unlocked. There was no crime element for them. However, the people that didn't live in Buxton, those were the ones that seemed like that, had said, there were always these sensational headlines about murder in Buxton. And so they would definitely have the impression that, no, this is a rough and ready town, and no, you shouldn't go there. But the people that lived there did not feel that way. And
so there may have been stories being spread beyond Buxton that it really didn't have a reflection of reality.
Yeah.
And could have had a racial motivation.
Well, they did say there were murders in Buxton, but it was usually around gambling, drinking, domestic disputes, those kinds of things. No one interviewed, they all pretty much agreed they weren't racially motivated. That, you can get in a fight with somebody because of, some other reason, but it wasn't because of race.
Listening to the oral histories, what kind of different perspective did you get from white residents and black residents of Buxton?
It was quite different. A lot of the Black residents were you could just hear the passion in their voices when they talked about Buxton. Whereas for a lot of the white residents, it was a nice town. They had, a good life there, but it was really more matter of fact. And that's also what I was listening to, when I wanted to know, did Black people really consider this, a utopia? Was it really that good, as you hear about? And the residents that were interviewed seemed to feel that way. And they spoke very glowingly about it. And they also mentioned that when they left, it was a shock to them because some of them had been born there and this is what they were used to. And then to leave from there and experience the racism that they did when they left Buxton was very shocking for them.
Well, and if we, again, put this into historical perspective at the turn of the 20th century, I mean, racism was rampant. Segregation was the norm all over the country and, of course, especially in the South. When you were looking at pictures, and this is, just as I mentioned, a wonderful collection of pictures from Buxton that just really transport you there in just a moment. Can you think of a couple that have really stood out for you that when you discovered this picture, it really told you more than you may have expected?
I think some of the pictures of the women in their, well-dressed, in their, finery, it really spoke to the fact that it was a thriving town, that there were people that were very successful. Now, granted, not everybody was. Many people said money flowed in Buxton. There was no shortage. But that doesn't mean that everybody, had money at the end of the day, right? Or that everybody was wealthy. But the point is that there were both kind of classes, if you will, in Buxton. And Marjorie Brown was someone who talked about that you did have the society, folks who went to all the, the women's clubs and such. And then you had those that had 14 kids and were really, really working just to support their family. So I think the pictures of the women, that were part of this Buxton society, that was very fascinating to me. I think also because mining is so different for me, I'm not from here, and so I really had no exposure to that. When I was looking at some of the actual pictures of the miners, down working, I mean, that was really amazing to me too, because I couldn't imagine what it would be like, to work in a mine. So
and
those
it was very dangerous, difficult work.
Very dangerous. So that was fascinating, as well as some of the miners' take on that. I didn't realize that also that some of those jobs were considered glamorous by women, So the mule driver, for example, that particular role, some of the men had said, well, yeah, I loved being a mule driver. The women loved me, So it was, okay, those are my words, not theirs. But still, that was pretty interesting too.
I'm talking with Rochelle Chase. She is the author of Lost Buxton. And I know the history of Buxton is something that a lot of people in Iowa have taken a lot of interest in. If you'd like to join our conversation with your favorite Buxton story or with a question for Rochelle, email talkofiowa@iowapublicradio.org. And part of the uniqueness of this community, of course, children growing up in this community, young people being a part of the community, they had an opportunity for education that many African-American young people just didn't have at that time. And you did some research about some of the really remarkable people who came out of Buxton, the first African-American man to graduate with a medical degree from the University of Iowa, for example. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the people who really made history?
Well, that was Dr. E.A. Carter, the one that you mentioned there, and he became a company doctor there in Buxton, one of three. And again, he would have both Black and white patients, so he wasn't just just seeing Black patients. There was also Hope Armstrong. He was someone that pretty much every resident that was interviewed almost knew of, and he was one of the recruiters that had gone down and recruited African Americans from the South to come work in the mines. But he had really close ties to the company, and so he had the only meat market, or the only business there in town that was allowed to use the company's check system. So very, very close ties, and what that means is they could buy on credit. He also was one of the wealthiest African Americans in southern Iowa. He owned about 1,600 or more acres, 18 farms that he would rent out to people. He had a slaughterhouse. He would buy also buy livestock from farmers in the area. He raced thoroughbreds, was very well known throughout Iowa for his thoroughbred racing. So he was one that was very well known there. George Woodson was also another prominent African American in town. He was an attorney, and he had also co-founded the Niagara movement, which became the NAACP, the Iowa Negro Bar, the National Bar Association. So he was very, very much involved there. Also had been active in the Republican Party, ran for a few offices, didn't win. But another one, very well known and very respected by the people in Buxton for being a great speaker and really just motivating people to better themselves.
Now, as I mentioned, Buxton is no longer. Buxton is a ghost town. Mm-hmm. What happened?
Well, all good things come to an end, I guess, which is interesting because when they built Buxton, it almost seemed like they weren't expecting that. You know, they had built the town with this level of permanence kind of in mind in the buildings. But in 1914, the demand for coal had started to decline. And so Buxton had experienced some layoffs. And that was also kind of new for Buxton since the coal was being supplied to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. They pretty much had, pretty much nonstop work. But in 1914...
And that was rare in a coal town because the demand for coal usually just declined in the summer if it was something that people were using in their homes. Right. So they had a client who needed coal year-round, which was one of the reasons that Buxton was so...
Exactly. But they had, like I said, in 1914, that they had the problems with the demand. And then also the mines were pretty much played out in and around Buxton. So they had started moving operations to Console and Haydock, opened 2 mines there. But things just, by about 1922, they pretty much had everybody was pretty much out of Buxton. And they were they'd moved to these other camps that were owned by Consolidation. But pretty much by 1927, those had pretty much ended as well, and they were no more.
We have a question from a listener. Were there any African-American elected officials in Buxton, Iowa? Now, it was a company town, so I don't even know if they had local government. No, the company was kind of in charge, right?
The company was in charge. They did have, African-American constables in town, but there weren't really any elected officials except for in the union. They did have some African-Americans that were union leaders. They did at one time have this organization that they called the Colony, which was kind of this informal, one of its roles was an informal kind of keeping people in check. Like if people were being too loud or, someone was being disruptive, they would impose fines on them. And they also, so they had elected officials for that particular organization, but there was no formal positions since it was not incorporated.
So when the mine ran out, when demand for coal lessened, and this was normal for a coal mining town to just kind of die. Yeah. But where did the people go? Iowa, as we know, there are some moments of progressive history in Iowa when it comes to race, but also it's been a fairly homogenous state, especially during that time. Did the African Americans who lived in Buxton, did they just leave the state?
Well, it's really been a little bit difficult to track down, where the most of people went. It seemed like people just kind of scattered. Some left the state. Dr. E.A. Carter ended up going to Detroit. Some people went to Chicago. Some people, like Hobe Armstrong, had kind of stayed in that area because he owned land. People went to Des Moines, Waukee. They went to other mines. The common thread, though, wherever they went, in Iowa was, here they were doing things in Buxton. And then when they went elsewhere, it was going back in time. I know one person who was a school teacher in Buxton had mentioned that when she left Buxton, she couldn't get a job. She worked as a cleaner, doing domestic work. So it really, people scattered all over, but there wasn't like one place that they went to.
What do you think the legacy is of this community? I mean, it's a fascinating story. It obviously captivated your imagination and your heart. But what do you think the legacy of Buxton is?
I think the legacy is is just the principles of inclusion and equality, and the difference that makes for the success of a town, and also in terms of people getting along and being able to really focus on their own lives, and their own goals. And I think also showing that that is possible because it comes from leadership, that it comes from, consolidation, setting the tone for this is the way this town is going to be. And I think it was a very effective example of that. So I think that is a big legacy for the town, what you can learn from it, why it was successful.
Rochelle Chase is the author of 2 books about Buxton, Iowa, Lost Buxton and Creating the Black Utopia of Buxton, Iowa. We're listening back to our 2017 conversation. Rochelle will also be an expert reader on the February edition of the Talk of Iowa Book Club. We'll be talking about The Color Purple by Alice Walker on Tuesday, February 20th, here on the air. You can also join our book club on Facebook. You can search for IPR's Talk of Iowa Book Club. And Rochelle also has a book coming out later this year for young readers about Susan Clark. In just a moment, we will listen back to a conversation about Susan Clark's father, Alexander Clark, who's best known for filing a lawsuit that resulted in the desegregation of Iowa schools in 1868. This is Talk of Iowa from IPR News.
Support for IPR comes from the Healing Room at Upstream Functional Medicine, offering medical spa services that support the body's natural ability to detoxify from environmental challenges. Learn more about the Healing Room at upstreamfm.com.
It's Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. Today, in honor of Black History Month, we're revisiting conversations about some important events in Iowa history. And now we're going to learn about Alexander Clark, a remarkable Iowan who 86 years before the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education, tried to enroll his daughter in Muscatine's Second Ward Common School. When he was denied, he took the district to court, and it was the first successful desegregation case in the history of the United States. That is just a small part of what he accomplished. In 2019, I spoke to Dwayne Coleman, who at the time was pursuing his PhD in history at the University of Iowa, and I started by asking him what brought this remarkable man to Muscatine, Iowa.
Yeah, he was really an amazing figure. I would argue that he is probably the most amazing figure in Iowa history during the 19th century, black or white. And that's for a number of different reasons. He had a long list of accomplishments in his 65 years that he lived. In coming to Iowa, he was an activist almost immediately. He came at a very young age. He was still in his teens when he arrived. And we start to really notice him being an activist in the Muscatine community around 1855, when there was a move by the black community of Muscatine to try to get rid of the 1851 exclusionary laws. There was an exclusionary act that was passed by the state of Iowa to exclude black people from entering into the state. And so Alexander Clark helped to organize the community, the black community of Muscatine, to petition the state government to repeal this act that was
Only
passed.
4 years after it was passed.
Yes. This was a continuing process, and and even after 1855, they continued to try to get that exclusionary law and also other laws that excluded African Americans from certain civil rights, citizenship rights as well. So he started from a very early age.
Wow. And it's so remarkable even to think about him taking on that role as activist. He was trained as a barber as a very young man, and that's what he practiced in Muscatine, right?
Right. He was trained by his uncle as a barber in Cincinnati. and he actually left Cincinnati in 1841. And I think one of the reasons why he left Cincinnati in that same year, a month before he left, there was a riot, a race riot that took place there, a race rebellion, in which the white citizens of many of the white citizens of Cincinnati tried to expel the black citizens from the city. Using an exclusionary law as well. Ohio had passed exclusionary laws. And so in moving to Iowa and facing the prospect of being forced out of Iowa as a result of these kinds of laws, you can see kind of the connection as to why he, became an activist.
Yeah. What was the black community like in Iowa in the 1850s?
It was rather small. I mean, it still is rather small today, but it was very small during the 1850s and 1840s. But African Americans have been in the state of Iowa since the territorial days. So African Americans have always made Iowa their home ever since. Other people, other Americans have been inhabiting Iowa as well, and so it was very small, but it was very closely. It was a very close-knit community because the people had to work together. And Alexander Clark was influential in helping to create those connections, those community connections.
Well, in Muscatine, I mean, it's right on the Mississippi River. I can imagine that there was a more flow of individuals coming from different parts of the country through Muscatine and the other river towns. So there must have been an exchange of ideas and people coming and going there.
Definitely, it was a hot spot, a hub for many different peoples coming through, and I think that's why Alexander Clark was drawn to it. I think that it was an up and coming city. I look at it very similar to the frontier city of Cincinnati. So I think that's what drew him to Muscatine, and as a result of his ingenuity, he was able to become a very successful businessman and wealthy in the state in Muscatine.
I want to talk about what are called the colored conventions in Iowa, and this is something that's the focus of your research right now. But tell me about these gatherings.
Right. So the colored conventions movement was a movement that began as a result of the 1829 Cincinnati race riot. The first colored convention was held in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in 1830. And the point of that movement was to discuss the issues that black communities faced. One of the main questions that many of these early conventions posed was whether or not they should even remain in the country.
Like, should we flee and go to Canada?
Right. And so, after the 1829 race riot, for instance, in Cincinnati, there were over 2,000 black residents who left Cincinnati, some of them for Canada. And so this movement became a national movement. And there were national conventions that were held. There were state conventions that were held. There were local conventions. And Iowa had a number of these held a number of these conventions as well, state conventions. And Alexander Clark was influential in organizing and carrying out these colored conventions in the state of Iowa. And so black Iowans asked the same questions. They asked the same questions about education rights, about citizenship rights here in the state of Iowa, and the question was even posed as to whether or not they should remain in Iowa, whether it was even possible for them to receive equal citizenship rights in the state of Iowa. And continually, the answer was a resounding, "We will stay. This is our home." So the colored conventions were very important to the fight for equal rights in the state of Iowa for black Americans.
The first of the colored conventions that took place, at least that we have record of in Iowa, was in 1857?
Right. Yeah, so in 1857, so this is 2 years after the petition that Clark and 32 other Muscatine Iowans signed petitioning for the repeal of the Exclusionary Act. And so the 1857 conference was to try to influence the Constitutional Convention that was taking place in Iowa during that time period to try to get certain black laws taken out of the state constitution. The word white removed from the state constitution, which then would allow black people certain citizenship rights, like right to sit on a jury, testify against a white person, education rights. So because of the word white used in the Constitution, it excluded black people from many of those rights.
I'm afraid I don't know my history that well. How long did it take for them to be successful in that effort?
Well, the progress was slow, and it happened over decades. It wasn't until the 1880s that all of the the laws that excluded blacks from certain rights was actually removed from the state constitution. But over time, the Exclusionary Act, for example, was overturned in 1863 during the Civil War. And I think a lot of the reason for that was because of the activism of Alexander Clark, who continued to push forward, the communities that continued to push for to remove these laws, but also because of the black soldiers during the Civil War
Who were fighting with the North in the Iowa Regiment.
Right. So Iowa created an all-black regiment during the Civil War. There were over 1,000 men who served in this regiment, and Alexander Clark was instrumental in recruiting members for that regiment. He was even known to have given away his the money he received for recruiting, which was about $2, which would have been, and he did this for at least around 50 men. He gave back that money, that $2, which would have been a substantial sum of money during that time period. And the reason being is because he felt that by pushing forward and getting black men the right to be soldiers, to have this regiment, would then allow them to claim citizenship rights. So this was part of a bigger move to claim citizenship rights for black people in the state of Iowa.
I think so often when we talk about these moments in history, we tend to simplify the narrative. And you're just reinforcing that there was a community, there was a vision, there was a plan, and they worked and worked and worked to move that agenda forward.
Right. Alexander Clark is little known still, but he's one of the more well-known individuals in black history here in Iowa. But there were many, many other people who were actively involved. Men and women, and oftentimes the women especially get overlooked in the story too. But his wife, Catherine Clark, was right there too. She was fighting right alongside Alexander Clark. Susan Clark, his daughter, both of his daughters, Rebecca and Susan. In fact, the petition in 1855 has Rebecca's name on it. What's interesting about that is she was only a year old at the time. So
let's talk about the school desegregation case, because again, I mean, this is, if you know a story about Alexander Clark, this is the story that you know. And even this story, we simplify, because this wasn't just one man fighting for his daughter's right to get educated. Tell me more about what was going on that led up to this case.
Right. So this was, again, a community movement among the black community there in Muscatine to try to integrate the schools in Muscatine. And so the black school that they had in Muscatine was actually held in the AME Church there in Muscatine, and the black community actually decided to. One of the reasonings being as to why there was no need to integrate the schools was because their black students could go to a black school. And so they decided that they were no longer going to have the black school anymore, so that they could make the argument that that the schools needed to be integrated. And so this was a community push, and Alexander Clark, yes, he took the lead as he often did. But I think what's interesting about that too is his daughter, Susan Clark, was put at the head of this. So during a time period in which women, especially young girls, and their education wasn't necessarily
not a priority.
A priority, exactly. Here is Alexander Clark and his daughter, right, and the community rallying behind Susan Clark in this push to try to integrate schools in Iowa. I think it's very profound and fascinating. And we have and she later, of course, in the case, they won. They went to the Supreme Court after the Muscatine School Board appealed the ruling, which was in the Clark's favor. I went to the Supreme Court, and they found that they found in favor of the Clarks.
It's interesting to me. Again, this was still 86 years before Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a really long time.
Right.
What were the ripple effects of this? I mean, did it substantially change life, at least for African Americans in Iowa?
It did. And at the same time, too, there were other attempts to try to integrate schools in Iowa, even before the Clark case came about. In fact, after the Civil War, directly after the Civil War, after the men of the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry, who were the Iowa Regiment, after they came home, there was an account that I've found in my research of two of those men who later settled in Newton, and immediately upon returning home, they enrolled in the local school there. This is in 1865, and there was some, of course, some anger from some of the white parents about their children going to school with these black men. But in using their military service, the political capital of their military service, and claiming the rights of citizenship, and also because of who they were and how they held themselves too, the community rallied around them and allowed them to continue to integrate these schools. So that case there, coupled with the Susan Clark case as well, helped to push forward desegregation of schools and desegregation of other facilities too for black people. But it was a constant thing. It was something that each community had to work at. But as a result, education became a very important part of life for African Americans in Iowa.
We talk about the pursuit of education, and Alexander Clark himself continued to pursue education. Now, first, his son, Alexander Jr., was the first African American to graduate from University of Iowa Law School. And then Alexander Clark himself became the second graduate in 1884.
Right. Yeah, so again, education was very important to African Americans in Iowa. And because, again, there was a law that actually forbade black people from becoming lawyers, and so a few years before Alexander Clark Jr. actually entered the university or the law school at Iowa, that law was eventually struck down or eventually changed. So in 1879, he was the first black graduate from the college.
Dwayne Coleman. We spoke in 2019 about Alexander Clark and the lawsuit he filed that resulted in the desegregation of Iowa schools in 1868. Last year, a children's book about Clark's daughter called Susie Clark, The Bravest Girl You've Ever Seen by Jocelyn Hickey Johnson was published by the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. Later this year, they'll be publishing a book for middle grade readers by Rochelle Chase. Talk of Iowa is a production of IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe.